and welcome to this meeting. My name is Kelvin and I'm a legal subjects teacher in the Property Services section at TAFE Digital. And today I'm going to deliver the first of a number of presentations, short presentations. And today's topic is on something very important to most real estate agents, which is exchange of contracts. So let me begin by trying to share my screen with you and show you this very short and I hope important and valuable presentation about exchange of contracts. So just bear with me a moment and I'll see if I can share my screen. So thank you for your patience. So the topic, as I said, is what does exchange of contracts mean? Before we begin, I just want to do a very brief acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land and to acknowledge or give my respects, or our respects to elders past, present and future and emerging of all nations. So let us begin. Now there's only three things I want to cover in this brief meeting, and the first one is to define exchange of contracts. Number two, to give you a little bit of background and recent history about the making or exchange of contracts. And thirdly, why is exchange of contracts so important to real estate salespersons? So here we have a form of definition or explanation. Exchange of contracts means the making of the contract. While the parties could lawfully use a single document, the convention or practice is to have two identical copies of the same contract, same document. One copy is signed by the vendor, that is the seller, and the other by the buyer, or what we call the purchaser. The signed contracts are then dated and exchanged, that is swapped over. The vendor holds a copy signed only by the purchaser, which allows the vendor to enforce the contract against the purchaser, and vice versa. Please note, it is acceptable to have only one document which is signed by both parties, or you can have two documents which are signed by both parties. But it is perhaps best to follow the traditional convention as described above. That is, there's two documents and you swap them or exchange them. I'd like to give you a little bit of background and recent history about exchange of contracts and point out that in New South Wales, and that's where we are, and we only teach legal subjects and ethics relevant to New South Wales, but in New South Wales it is increasingly common for the selling agents to attend to the exchange of contracts on behalf of the vendor and the purchaser. The vendor, by the way, is the principal of the agent, right? So the vendor or the seller is the one that the agent represents. And there is a written agency agreement. In fact, there must be a written agency agreement in force between the agent and the principal before there can be an exchange. Exchange of contracts may also be completed by the respective solicitors or licensed conveyancers, although most of the time, these days, it'll be done by the agent. An agent should not exchange contracts without authority, which can be written, spoken, or implied. And I'll just correct that little typographical error there. And finally, it is best to have written authority. Next question, why is exchange of contracts so important to real estate agent salespersons? Well, once a contract is exchanged unconditionally, it is as good as money in the bank, or so many agents say. In agent speak, a conditional exchange could be a contract subject to a cooling off period or subject to finance approval. An unconditional exchange could be a sale by auction or an exchange by private treaty where the purchaser waives the cooling off period. Broadly speaking, the two main ways to bring about an exchange of contracts is either going to be at an auction, where the auction is successful, but that is the buyer is found, or by the alternative, which is private treaty. Now, the vast majority of unconditional contracts, this is very important to know, the vast majority of unconditional contracts are completed or settled, right? I haven't been able to find any statistics on this, and I don't think they exist, but I can tell you from my own experience over 4.5 decades of being a conveyancing solicitor that once the contracts are exchanged, almost certainly they're going to settle. Now, there's a very tiny proportion, which is probably about 3 or 4% maybe, maximum I would guess, that don't settle. That can happen for a number of reasons. One of the parties might die, or they might not have the money to complete. They might be forced to breach the contract. But most of the time, once the contract is exchanged, it will proceed to settlement. Now, this is the most important bit of all. Once settlement is completed, the selling agent becomes entitled to the agreed commission. You've got to remember that the commission for an agent is what some people call a success fee. So generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the success fee won't be paid unless, one, the agent is responsible for introducing the buyer to the property, and secondly, the contract is exchanged and completed. So I can talk about that more in another meeting, and thank you very much for coming along today. Goodbye.